things. The first, I think, is around what do I mean by levelling up, and therefore what I think it should mean for the government. Secondly, what we need to recognise in terms of some of the fiscal realities which need to be acknowledged in the way in which that policy is to be moved forward. And finally, some things around leadership and delivery, which I think are particularly important and which have been heightened during this crisis. So, first of all, what do I think levelling up means? Very interesting, really, is that for about 12 months, we've been treated to a variety of analyses by government about levelling up, which has not really got beyond the description of levelling up at all. And for me, there are two broad planks which need to be addressed. The first comes under the heading of productivity. That's been an issue in this country, I think, for a very, very long time. We've looked at productivity nationally. We don't compare well with our G20 counterparts. So for me, it's not just around how do we become more competitive as a country, and there are things which we need to do to address that. It's also about how do all parts of the country become competitive as well. So it's a two-edged coin here. So it's not just about moving stuff from the southeast or the north of England, where I live, becoming just as competitive as London. It's also about how the UK as a whole becomes more competitive as an economic entity in comparison with G20 companies. So if you talk to the economists, when you talk about productivity, fundamentally we're talking about how do we reinvest in research and development, how do we build on our universities as centres of innovation and collaboration, how do we foster business support and collaboration and diversify our wider economic base. And of course, it's also about how do we invest in infrastructure to make sure all our cities and regions are better connected, and how we secure access by people to jobs which are actually being created. I think that's the pretty standard analysis about productivity. I think there's another standard as well around productivity which needs to be addressed, and that goes right to the heart of people. I think that will be of particular interest to the audience today. How do we tackle inequalities in earnings, which have been, as we know, earnings generally have been stagnant, and living standards stagnant for the last 10 years, and that has intensified levels of inequalities in our country. Many of you will have had first-hand experience, I know I had for many, many years, about how significant variations in population health impact on the life chances and well-being of many people in our communities. We all recognise also how access to jobs differs in different parts of the country. That's not just about the availability of jobs, it's also about the mix between skills and the people who live in places and the jobs that are actually being created in places. So for me, when we talk about levelling up, there's both a traditional analysis around how you drive productivity through investment in infrastructure and research, development, universities, and crucially matching that with complementary policies and approaches which underpin the life chances and the potential of people. I have not heard that analysis from any government minister over the last 12 months, quite frankly, and I spend most of my time on in platforms such as this, talking about why that definition of levelling up needs to embrace that full range of programmes. And more particularly the requirement to develop what I would describe as a basket of indicators which fairly reflect people and place in the way in which levelling up policies are actually going to be mounted and measured in terms of impact in the future. So that's my first big point. My second big point, as it were, is, you know, we've got a real fundamental dilemma and choices that have got to be made over the coming months, because it's absolutely clear that the level of national resource that can be devoted to all of our programs is going to be heavily impacted by what's been spent to respond, and we can all have a view about how effective that response has been to the present national or global health crisis. You know, in this country alone, over £200 billion has been spent over the first 6 months of this year, which is all unaccounted for in any budgets, certainly not budgets that were determined before the crisis began. And it's fairly clear we're going to have to spend billions and billions of pounds more until we have any hope of coming out of this. So therefore, being realistic, there has to be a trade-off here about what we mean by levelling up, and more particularly how we approach that in terms of pursuing real policies. And for me, if there's one silver lining in this, it's that if we are going to make any meaningful impact on that wider policy priority, which obviously I believe we must, then it is absolutely essential that the full range of government programmes are aligned and coordinated in order to actively pursue that key priority. And I just want to give a few examples about what that can mean. So how we spend our transport, housing, skills budgets needs to be brought into very, very sharp focus in this area. You know, where I come from in the north of England, like many of our participants on this programme, you know, we spend on average at least 2 or 3 times less per capita, you know, on transport and housing in this part of the world compared with other parts of the country, particularly the south of the country. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why levelling up became such an important part of the government's narrative towards the end of last year, leading up to the election and beyond, because our investment levels in many parts of the north of England and the Midlands and elsewhere were not quite in tune with that key priority. But there are other programmes which are being brought forward. You know, there's going to be a big pitch, I believe, in the autumn around research and development. Government, rightly, if they want to tackle some of the key productivity challenges, are going to increase significantly, and that's already earmarked within existing budgets, our support for research and development. And because of some of the work I've been doing over the last few months, you know, there was a Nesta study which was undertaken, which showed that if the government's priority of improving public investment in research and development just by 2.4% to 2027, that would mean additional spending in Greater Manchester alone of over 250 million per annum just on research and development. That's quite a significant requirement. And of course, what we have to do is not just invest in all the high-end stuff, and Manchester's blessed, along with other cities in the north of England and elsewhere, with very, very strong global platforms around advanced materials, data, life science. But we also need to invest in that broader innovation platform as well. What that means for town centres throughout Greater Manchester, and also crucially what it means for our health innovation system as well. If there's been one aspect of this current crisis which has pleased me in terms of the local response, it's been the way in which most agencies in Greater Manchester in particular, taking advantage of the devolution arrangements that we negotiated several years ago, have actually taken huge strides in consolidating data, patient data, in order to integrate that with the way in which primary care in particular, as well as other parts of the health and care system, have been able to manage their way as best they can through this crisis. And it seems to me there is a remarkable opportunity to use that and develop that as a platform to actually start to address, well, what can all of that mean in terms of new health and care models? What can that mean in terms of new community facilities? And what can that mean for developing wider programs of public sector reform, which all of us recognise is required so that we really sharpen up our commissioning capabilities. I'll just make one final point just to demonstrate the illogicality of government proposals. So at a time when they are talking about levelling up, they then produce a planning white paper, which may or may not interest many of you. It certainly interests me, which shows that, well, we're going to have big housing number requirements. So what we're going to do, we're going to build less in places in the big cities, which has got the greater capacity to absorb housing requirements, and we're going to build more in parts of London which has the least capacity to absorb it. There is real inconsistencies in government policy in the way in which this stuff is driven forward. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was place leadership. I think whatever view you take about Manchester's performance, or indeed some of the performance of other big cities over the last decade or more, I think there is some degree of coincidence between transformational change and place leadership. You know, I never ever saw myself as the chief executive of the city council in Manchester. I always saw myself as the chief executive of Manchester, the city. There is a distinction in that, and therefore developing that very strong vision, working with a whole range of stakeholders in the evolution and execution of that vision was always something which I saw as being a fundamental part of my job. And as part of that, it is also clear that we have to rethink constitutional relationships between the centre and local places. You know, it's called devolution. Devolution worked to an extent when we had a senior Conservative politician in power who understood it and wanted to make things happen. Unfortunately, we've not had a similar senior politician in government who either has the same priority or indeed whether the government since have the same priority. And I think we've seen during this crisis the importance of a different requirement for a different approach. I think many of the frailties, weaknesses, some would call it other things, of our national response, particularly around test and trace, has been linked to an inability to move away from national delivery models. National delivery models don't work, and we know many of the things which I talked about not only need a national framework for prioritisation, but crucially need a very hard-edged delivery at local neighbourhood level, and you can't deliver at local level from Whitehall. We all know that, we live through that almost on a daily basis. So I think we are looking for a new system of working here. I don't think this government really believes in devolution. So we have to come up with a different way of arguing for this. I prefer partnership between national, local places, something which actually enables priorities to be married, something which enables investment priorities to be aligned, and something which enables accountabilities to be reworked. It happens in other parts of the world very successfully. I think on health devolution, it's worked reasonably well in Greater Manchester, certainly over the past couple of years. And I believe if we are going to secure a meaningful long-term change in the context of levelling up, then the concept of partnership, place-based settlements, enhanced local leadership is absolutely the key in making that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Howard. That was amazing. Sorry, it's just really, really interesting to hear you say so much of the stuff